Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name's Reed. Along with me is Mike. Mike, how you doing, sir?
Doing good. Two guys. There's the stack of comics back there.
Got the stack back there. Um, we had previously done a video recently about how we both prefer the DC universe over the Marvel universe. I think both of us do like Marvel, but I think we'd say DC we just feels a little better. So this is not necessarily a why Marvel stinks video or anything like that. It's more just why we think
No,
there's a lot of value in
you
DC.
know what? I like a lot of Marvel comics. I always did, even from the beginning. I was one of the rare kids back in the day that bought both types.
Hmm.
And back in the day, it really was a click. Like you either have to be like my friend Crawford. He was a Marvel guy, and my cousins were all Marvel guys. And they're
Yeah.
like, "What are you doing with an Iron Man or Daredevil comic, Mikey?" And I'm like, I like a good Daredevil story, as much as the next guy. I would pick up Avengers and enjoy those right along with my copy of Flash or Detective Comics, whatever I was picking up. So yeah, no hating on Marvel. I gravitated that way towards DC. My favorite character is the Flash. So anything that had the Flash in it, whether it be Justice League or whatever, I was all about it. So I just, gravitated towards DC. I really did for the most part. But I always enjoy a good Marvel story. Classic characters, great stuff.
Yep.
I'm just glad to be talking comics, man. That's really cool.
No, I think, Marvel, it's interesting. I think, like you said, I think there is sometimes a very staunch rivalry between the two. And I've never really understood that either. I would always say I'm a DC guy, but Marvel, I would say, I mean, if I looked at my comic spending habits in my life, about like 65% DC and then 35% Marvel.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
probably somewhere in the same range. And I think Stan Lee had more to do with that rivalry than anything else because for decades, Marvel was always chasing DC for sales,
mhm.
and DC was always seen as the main competition. And, when Stan would, get in the soapbox, he'd always say, those other guys, or whatever, how he used to put
Yeah.
that? We're better than those other guys. And, these are quality comics going on over here as opposed to the other guys,
Yeah.
and so I think that just kind of fueled the fan base and kind of seeped into the,
Seeped
you know,
into how the fandom works. And I mean,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
think that's a thing now. I mean, we look at, I think it's very hard, even me and you as DC guys. It's very difficult to say that Marvel's not in first place everywhere. I think average
Oh,
comic
yeah.
sales per month, Marvel's first. The movies, clearly Marvel won that one.
But
DC has a few things. Yeah.
back in the day, it was DC was the powerhouse that kept comic books going through the dark ages of the 50s. There
Hmm.
is a really cool book I got to loan you about that time frame.
Yeah.
And there's also another really cool book that where a modern artist and writer kind of tried to fill in the gap of those lost years in the 50s. But this book is called The 10 Cent Plague,
Uh-huh.
and I'll loan it to you next time I see you. And then we'll talk about it,
Talk about it
about
on camera, sure.
the dark era of the 50s. But DC was king back then, no doubt. Everybody else was just trying to keep up, and guys like Jack Kirby were scrambling around trying to get a job. It was rough times.
Yeah. No, and I think, looking at the modern portion of comics, me and you, in the first part of this, we kind of talked about how I think the heroes we like a little better in DC because there's a little more disparity between them as far as the Flash is very different than Batman and Green Lantern. They inhabit these different cities and different worlds. And there's great characters in Marvel, but they all kind of inhabit New York. And I think over time, a lot of their personalities have morphed into the same thing. I think we also talked a little bit about how relationships in DC have always been more important. The Superman Lois Lane dynamic, Barry and Iris, Wally and Linda, um, Aquaman and Mira, that kind of thing. Whereas Marvel, outside of Spider-Man and Reed and Sue, that's kind of been to the wayside. The other portion that you and I have always talked about, and I think, man, as long as we've known each other, I think me and you both have always believed the villains of DC Comics are superior to Marvel. Now, this is not to say Marvel obviously has some fantastic villains, but Mike there holding up the classic kind of the rogues there from the Flash.
Yeah, I pulled it out of the old Flash archives there
Um, and
just
so
for tonight.
obviously, Spider-Man's got great villains. I think there's some strong X-Men villains, but I think across the board, I think DC has just slightly better villains. So, Mike, I'll let you kick it off. What is it about the DC villains that you think resonates just a little more with you as a reader or a fan than say those of Marvel?
You know, I always liked I always my favorite and most villainous of villains were always DC. But it's a good villain. The way you tell it's a good villain is when they appear in the comic and you're like, oh, I hate that guy. No, you're gonna ruin everything. And for me, nobody did it better than the Joker and the Reverse Flash.
Hmm.
The Joker for Batman, a classic, like psychotic murderer, kind of crazy chaos. Just in your plot line, you can dump a load of chaos and just put the Joker in it. And the
Yep.
same thing for Reverse Flash, like any Flash story, all of a sudden, like, Reverse Flash shows up. So for me, for these two as my favorite villains, the way they were written is so amazing. And the Joker goes all the way back to like 1940.
Yeah.
Jerry Robinson created him. He was like the perfect, I think in an interview, he said he was or somebody once said he was the perfect pulp villain, because he was crazy, he was homicidal, and that's a perfect match for the chaos, which Batman is very methodical, you
Yeah.
know,
Batman's all about order. Yeah.
yeah, and the Joker is all about chaos. So you put those two together, you're always going to have good tension in your plot. And the same thing with Reverse Flash. I mean, the Reverse Flash is everything that Flash isn't, but he's just as fast and sometimes faster. And
Hmm.
it just makes for, and he's the complete antithesis, as his name suggests, and and it just makes for great plot tension, and they've done terrible things to our characters over the years that we'll never forgive them for, but that's what they're all about, all the way back to, and just for tonight's video,
Yeah. Yeah.
1963. There's the first appearance of Eobard Thawne and the Reverse Flash. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think one of the things you highlight, I think DC's villains really, to me, always have an ideological opposite to the hero. And I don't see that as much in Marvels. I think there's a few great Marvels that do. I think Magneto obviously is kind of an ideological
yes,
opposite to Xavier. And I think that's why he has always been such a great villain. But when you talk about Batman and Joker, right, you really have it's this titanic struggle of ideals. It's not even
yeah,
really the physical struggle between the two. It is the Joker's entire goal is just to create the opposite of what Batman wants. Even to the point that Joker, I think, where he's been such a great villain, is the Joker will have plots where he knows he's going to technically lose, but that will still be a win for him.
just to piss Batman off.
Yeah. I think Lex Luthor has always been a fantastic foil for Superman in that I
Very
think
good.
especially the great renditions of Lex you've had where Lex is kind of this above reproach citizen where Superman could beat him, but Superman will always do things by the book. And
Yeah,
Lex, through corruption and through running things, has
yeah,
it where Superman could use his powers to win, but can't because he's got to do it by the book. I think, you mentioned the rogues. I think the rogues are all very fascinating characters in the way that they kind of challenge different pieces of Barry Allen. But certainly Thawne has been one where it's essentially, the ideological opposite. Marvel to me, and again, I think they've got great villains. But I would say while Spider-Man, I think, has by far the greatest rogues gallery of any, Marvel character, I really have a hard time of finding where like the Marvel villains are, other than Magneto, like the absolute antithesis of the hero, where
Yeah,
they're just it kind of just seems like it's just a bad person, and sometimes they're written really well, but I don't get that kind of titanic sense of struggle that exists between like Batman and Joker or Superman and Lex between any of those characters.
and one of the great storylines, and this isn't comic book, and they deviated way far away from the comic book, but in Smallville, the way
Mhm.
Lex progressed was
Yes.
just, it was so well done, and you can do a lot with those characters, and you can tell because generations of writers have reinvented them and brought them into modern comics, and they still hold up extremely well
Yeah.
and drive and help drive plots and interest. And like I said, you get crazy when you get no Joker, no, not now. But Batman was just about to, yeah,
Well, and I think another thing, and I think that you mentioned, DC to me lets the villains get some actually substantial victories over the heroes. When you
it's
look at the
painfully true when it comes to the Flash, and the Reverse Flash is painfully true.
no, and you look at the Joker, I think part of what's made him such a great villain. I mean, he's taken major players off the board, and obviously through the magic of retcons and things like that. But the Joker killed a Robin. The Joker paralyzed Barbara Gordon. The Joker killed Gordon's second wife's Lieutenant Essen. I mean, like they've had the Joker score some major victories over
Same
the
with
years.
Thawne in Flash,
The Flash just had the same thing, I know it was in a later edition, but Thawne, being the one responsible for Barry's mom's murder.
Yeah,
Um, they have had times, I think, in DC comic, Lex Luthor becoming the president. And it's not that these things have not
that
happened
one's
in
classic,
Marvel.
right?
Yeah.
Lex Luthor became
Um,
president.
it's not that Marvel has not done these things. I just feel like across the board, Marvel to me, other than a few, I think Kingpin and Daredevil has a very similar dynamic to kind of a Batman and Joker. Green Goblin and Spider-Man has a little bit of that, and with killing Gwen Stacy.
Yes.
You've had Sabretooth and Wolverine, Magneto. But I just kind of feel across the board, like Iron Man, to be honest, for such a great character. The weirdest thing to me about Marvel, right? And I know part of it was done for, political reasons as far as they didn't really want to delve into the character. If you go into Iron Man's comic history, the Mandarin is by far his biggest villain. And
Yeah.
in the movies, really didn't get the Mandarin. You got Aldrich Killian, who is a different character. And I know there's I am the Mandarin, he says in the movie, but it's not the traditional 10 rings
That was
wielding
kind of depressing,
Mandarin.
right? When you found out that the Mandarin wasn't the
But
Mandarin, it
yeah,
was
just
the
it was a
master.
bluff.
I was like,
Um,
what?
but what's crazy about that to me is you had 10 years of Iron Man on screen. By far his biggest comic villain never appeared in his complete story. And what's weird is it didn't really affect how anyone saw Iron Man.
Yeah.
I can't imagine if we had a decade of DC films and you did a Batman thing and we never did the Joker. I think people would be like, man, that's not a Batman story. I think the
Yes.
same thing with Superman, and I feel like a lot of the Avengers folks, the Hulk, to be honest, the Hulk has been in the MCU for a long time. And I know he's got the Abomination and the Leader, he's got some good villains. But again, you've had him in these movies. I haven't seen a lot of people clamoring like, no, it's not a real Hulk story because we haven't gotten this character or that character.
Abomination. Yeah.
Whereas, DC, I think if you had flip flopped it and had where DC was, the position of the MCU, had you gone a decade of, Batman stories or Flash stories and not included some of the iconic villains, I think there'd be a lot of folks going, man, like this is a real missed opportunity.
Yeah, it's part of the comic book legend. When you go and create a character, and now these characters are so iconic, their villains are equally as iconic. It's like you can't really have a true Flash storyline now that doesn't include the Reverse Flash at some
Yeah.
point. It's got to be in there. But that just is a testament to Jeff Johns, and the way he brought him back in Flashpoint and just kind of reset the DC universe at that point,
Yeah.
and gave them a new jumping off point, which they needed. I don't
Well,
know
I think
about
the
the
interesting thing too, I mean, DC has had so many times where the villains themselves kind of get their own books, and because
Yeah,
they're intriguing enough. And that's not that that hasn't happened in Marvel, but it's not as frequent. Pretty much my entire lifetime, Deathstroke has had a comic book, a solo book that is him. The Joker has had frequent. The
I
Joker
re
had a $1 billion movie that was just about the Joker. And while I'm not the biggest fan of that film, it's still raked in $1 billion because the interest. Harley Quinn, has been the lead of multiple films. I think she's got an animated series that's been running for a couple years. I think the Batman villains culturally have become to where they're almost as iconic as Batman himself. I think you've just had so many of characters like that, and I think even and we're just delving Batman, Superman, Flash. You look at some of the great characters like Sinestro for
oh
Green
yeah, the
Lantern,
Green Lantern.
Black Manta for Aquaman. I think that's the other thing is all of the DC heroes seem to have that one true nemesis. That one that kind of is like Bowser to Mario, like the big bad that at the end of the castle, the big fight, it's
Yeah,
going to happen. Marvel, I mean, it's funny in that like I'm a huge Spider-Man fan, and I think in terms of, I would say Green Goblin's probably his greatest villain, but there's a lot of people who go, no, it's Doc Ock or it's Venom or it's a bunch of different characters, and I think that's the
Spider-Man
interesting part.
has a truly strong rogues
Rose
gallery.
Gallery,
Yeah, he
yeah.
really. But would you pay to go see a Doc Ock movie?
No, I think that's the interesting part of it is
Yeah,
DC has found a way to, I think, Suicide Squad for all the junk it gets for not being a good movie, and I think you and I don't like that film, but it made what $775 million, something like that. Joker made $1 billion. Now you look at Sony with the Spider-Man villain movies, and the first Venom was successful, but largely it just made Venom a hero. Um, there's not
yeah.
a lot of villain movies that get released. There's not a lot of, that they don't really seem to get. Morbius was a disaster. They're making a Craven movie that looks like they probably should have just not made it. Um, it's just interesting in that I think DC found a way to create these icons on both the heroic and the villainous side that it really does not feel like a complete universe. And we talked about this in the last one, right? If you're doing Superman, if you mess up Lois Lane, it almost ruins the story just as much as if you messed up Superman. And I feel
Yeah,
like that same thing, if you mess up Lex Luthor,
yeah.
that is almost as huge as messing up, Superman. And that like one of the things that kills me, and me and you'll probably do a video about this at some point about the DCEU and all the failures they had. You go back at Batman versus Superman, where that trouble is that movie's in trouble. The Lex Luthor in that film is so far off base that it's like
They
it killed any engagement you were going to have in that film.
they were trying to make him into like Mark Zuckerberg or something.
Yeah. They cast the same guy who played
An,
Zuckerberg in the movie.
an
Yeah.
evil Elon Musk or somebody, something like that. Let me ask you this: do you think, like John Brum, who was a
Mhm.
master craftsman uh, on the Flash, he was the writer, created Reverse Flash.
Yeah.
Jerry Robinson created the Joker,
Yeah.
although Bob Kane got credit for it,
Of
but
course. Bob Kane stealing credit from everything again.
yeah. But would you think it's just a testament to the writers to create those villains, or do you think it was more when Marvel was cooking in the early '60s that they were all about the heroes and they? I mean, you could
I think it's
arguably
more a
say Jack
testament to the
Kirby has
DC.
created some good villains. Kirby has.
uh,
He
Yeah.
created a lot of good ones in the DC years.
Yeah. No, I mean, Darkseid, Kirby went over and created, the ultimate
Yeah.
cosmic threat. I
Do
think,
you think the reins were kind of pulled on the villains, or
I,
what do you think?
I feel like DC, in a way, I think one of the things we love in stories is you love someone who is the ideological opposite. And you and I've talked about this with comic books. There's really not a lot of doubt whether the hero is going to win or lose in the comic, right? You're not really, when I read a Batman comic, there's not a lot of doubt that, oh, is
I don't
Batman
know.
going to get the
That's
job
the
done?
thing. When Reverse Flash jumps into the story, you know there's a chance Flash is going to
Yeah.
lose.
What
Same
I
thing with the
think
Joker and Batman.
the great ones, there'll
Yeah,
be collateral damage though. And I
yeah.
think that's the thing I think DC has had is that there's no doubt that Batman's not going to let Gotham get taken over, but the Joker will score some major victories along the way. And I
Yeah.
think this is the same reluctance we talked about with Marvel and why we like DC. Marvel just does not seem to have the capability to commit to like lasting huge changes. I think, in DC, not that DC doesn't retcon things, but the fact that Jason Todd was dead, that they let the Joker score that big of a win on Batman for years, and obviously he came back, 20 something years later, was huge. The fact that, they let Bane, it's been about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, Bane killed Alfred, that they've let that stand. And while I may not be a huge fan of all those things, I think it does make those villains feel like a genuine threat of like, man, they're not gonna, like Luthor's not going to beat Superman, but he might take something from him. He
Yeah.
might take a major character off the board. And I feel like Spider-Man to me used to get this right. I thought that was where the death of Gwen Stacy being one of the most iconic comics ever. I think even in the 80s, they had stuff like Jean DeWolf, the police cop that he was friends with, got killed. But it feels like lately they just can't take things off the board. It's always just let's reset it, let's get it back, let's restore things back to the norm. And I do feel, at least, not that DC's not guilty of that. Obviously, bad writers will bad write and do bad things. But I do feel like in the history of DC, there's been more times where the villains were able to get the major kind of like just hit on the character. And it's like the character survives, but the books are different for a while. And
Yeah.
I haven't seen that from Marvel in a while.
It's a consequence in a medium like comic books where, everybody's liable to come back from the dead next month. It's significant when, the storytellers behind these stories that we love so much, respect and commit to what the previous author had done with the character. you
Hmm.
know and if it was done right and respectfully, and the story changed for the better or became more interesting, you
Hmm.
know they'll let it stand, rather than, oh, so and so got it wrong, I'm just going to rewrite everything now, or
Yeah.
pretend we're in universe 621 instead.
No, and that's another one you and I'll do. We're going to talk about our complaints about multiverses and whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing for comics.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I would say, let us know what you think down below. And again, this is not saying there's not great Marvel villains. I think Doctor Doom is one of the greatest villains ever. I think
Oh my
and
God,
Green
Dr.
Goblin,
Doom.
he has been there, but I think across the board, I think, well, Marvel's got some good villains. I think they have not, in my opinion, allowed those villains to have massive enough consequences on the hero. And I think as a result, it kind of damages him a bit, other than Spider-Man, who I think is exempt, because I think Spider-Man, to the credit of all the great writers that have worked on that book, they've had some. I think Daredevil. I think that's another reason I've been invested in Daredevil, because of that. They've let the Kingpin score some major victories on Daredevil.
I'll give
Bullseye,
Daredevil that. That always kept me reading. Daredevil was
Bullseye has
key for
scored
me.
some huge hits
Yes.
on Daredevil.
Even in
But
the
it kind
movies
of
too.
feels, like Captain America, like the Red Skull, and I know, he not a whole lot of hits there. The Mandarin doesn't really, and again, maybe there's some victories they've had, but it always seems to be kind of reset. Whereas, what I think we've mentioned this, Daredevil, I think was one we both like. They took Karen Page off the board early 2000s with Bullseye killing her. Karen has not come back. There hasn't been a retcon of, oh, well, Karen actually survived, or we're going to pull a multiverse copy of Karen and she's Dare Karen or whatever now. And she's like, half like they do with these characters now.
Spider clone.
Yeah. I think the fact that they've allowed that stuff to resonate. I think Sabretooth with Wolverine's another one. They've let Sabretooth kill major characters in Wolverine's life.
It
Well, I
just
would
gives the
just,
story a little more weight to it.
yeah. One, it
When
makes them a genuine threat, and I think that's where DC has, in my opinion, crafted some better villains, in that they've allowed that. The Flash, he can beat Reverse Flash, but with the way the Reverse Flash took his mom from him,
Yeah.
that's a major victory for all time that he can't fix.
Yeah.
Jason Todd being taken out by the Joker, even though he's bought back, the damage that did to Jason and his relationship with Bruce, that stands for all time. And I think, Marvel has had a few, but not with a lot of their heroes. But let us know what you think below. Again, this is one of the reasons me and Mike love DC, is just a little bit more investment in the villains themselves. But let us know what you think below. Do you think the villains of Marvel or DC are better? If you disagree with us, we'd love to hear why. It's always great to have new discussions and things. And maybe we've missed some stories in there that you can kind of bring to light. I think one of the great things about this is we always want to see if we can just get some engagement and have you guys kind of mention some things. And Mike and I have read a lot of comics, but by no means can we say that we are the experts on every comic story ever. So if there's
No.
great stuff that maybe we're missing or some things out there, but hopefully you'll check it out and let us know what you think below. But thanks again for watching, and we will see you with our next video.
Bye.